If you live in downtown LaGrange, Kentucky, you'll notice an old British steam locomotive sitting at the LaGrange Railroad Museum. Upon first glance, you'll notice that the locomotive's design is British in origin. You'll take a hard look at it and you'll ask yourself the question, how'd that get there? This documentary will cover the obscure history of the Flying Duchess, and how the British steam locomotive got to America. The locomotive, originally known as Medford No. 2, was constructed by Robert Stephenson in Hathorne in 1951 to 1952. The locomotive was one of many in the 060T wheel configuration tank engines built by the company. The locomotive's primary duties consisted of shunting coal hoppers at the Medford Power Station. The Medford Power Station was located on the River Trent near Stone and Stafford, England. The power plant was commissioned in 1947 and was decommissioned in 1990. Medford No. 2 operated at the Medford Power Station from 1952 until 1970. Sister locomotive Medford No. 1 was sold the following year. With steam power on the decline in the United Kingdom during the 1970s, the locomotive's future seemed to be in doubt, but Medford No. 2 was purchased by another railroad. Medford No. 2 would serve a different purpose in a different country. Medford No. 2 was sold to the Boyne City Railroad in Boyne City, Michigan. The engine received a new name, the Flying Duchess. Since the Flying Duchess was imported from the United Kingdom to the United States, the engine had to undergo multiple modifications to comply with American railroad regulations. The engine was fitted with Buckeye couplings and a high-intensity headlamp in front of the funnel. It is up for debate as to why the Boyne City Railroad purchased a British steam locomotive and British passenger cars. Whatever the case may be, the Flying Duchess proved to be very popular with locals and tourists. Up until 1978, the Flying Duchess would pull British-style passenger excursions on the 7-mile structured track owned by the railroad. In 1978, the Federal Railroad Administration did a survey of the tracks and determined that they were not safe for continued passenger service without an extensive overhaul. Due to the railroad being incapable of raising the capital needed for repairs, in summer of 1978, the railroad was forced to liquidate its assets, including the Flying Duchess. The engine was sold off to a railroad museum.
There's an official Tennessee museum you might not know about. There's a lot of old things just lying around and the usual displays. Oh, I guess we're a lot like other museums, but we are different in one way. We move. We're the Tennessee Valley Railroading Museum, and we're rolling 7 days a week over history-haunted rails. Take I-75 to 153 Jersey Pike exit. Come ride with us and experience the romance of American railroading.
The museum wanted to put the engine back into passenger excursion service. However, there were problems from the start. There was no acceptable documentation for the boiler. This meant in order to operate the engine, it required special boiler permits from the state of Tennessee. This in turn severely limited the engine's use. The Flying Duchess only operated for approximately 3 years. Ultimately, passenger excursion operations was turned over to Southern Railway's number 4501. The Flying Duchess was sidelined indefinitely. The Flying Duchess was put on static display until 2000. As the years went by, the museum did not cosmetically maintain the locomotive. As a result, it fell into a state of disrepair. The paint was sun-bleached, and rust was starting to show up all over the locomotive. In 2000, the Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum sold off the engine to Indiana. The unknown buyer in Indiana sold off the engine to a scrapyard in Louisville, Kentucky. The engine's future is now bleak. However, salvation would come in the form of the Ohio Valley Railroad Historical Foundation. In early 2011, the Ohio Valley Railroad Historical Foundation was able to obtain the locomotive from the scrapyard. The Flying Duchess was transported to the LaGrange Railroad Museum by flatbed truck. On August 23rd, the Flying Duchess arrived at the LaGrange Railroad Museum. Before August of 2011, the LaGrange Railroad Museum never had a locomotive on display. On August 24th, the Flying Duchess was lifted onto its new set of rails. Shortly afterwards, the engine's water tanks were salvaged from the scrapyard and was placed back on the Flying Duchess at the museum. The rest of the original parts could not be obtained, with most of the original engine reassembled. The next phase of the restoration process is volunteer work and fundraising. The museum added extra track behind the Flying Duchess to accommodate future rolling stock that they would purchase at a later date. So for a while, the Flying Duchess would stand there alone with CSX trains passing it constantly. With more funds now being available, restoration work can now start on the engine. Around the same time, the museum bought a disused Plymouth shunter and a flatbed car that would go behind the engine. These would also be restored with the Flying Duchess. Around the same time, the museum purchased a 1929 dining car and a caboose. At this point, the museum staff painted the Flying Duchess in matte black to slow down the rusting. This would only serve as a temporary measure until funding is available for restoration. In July of 2014, the matte black paint was painted over with glossy black paint. This was done in preparation for the application of the green, yellow, and red paint. Finally, in 2018, over half a decade of hard work later, the Flying Duchess was nearly cosmetically restored. The new livery is a combination of the original Medford No. 2 livery and original Flying Duchess livery. One thing to note about the restoration is the various creative liberties in the artwork, such as the Flying Duchess name being put in the British Railway style logo, the inclusion of a red painted bell and horn, the number 7745 and A symbol painted on the coal bunker and the smokebox door, green, yellow, and red paint on the rear cab, green and yellow markings on the coupling rods, yellow and green grab handles on the footplate, yellow paint in the center of the wheels, red painted underframe, green buffers and a red coupling hook, green paint on the funnel, smokebox door, and a red headlamp. Since the Flying Duchess was placed on CSX property, the museum has to make a once per year payment to CSX to lease the land. The next phase of restoration work on the Flying Duchess is expected to take place in the near future. The cab grab handles, coupling rods, stepladder, and cylinder covers still need to be installed and painted on the right side of the engine. The museum plans on having the original Medford No. 2 logo painted on the unfinished side. The dining car and the caboose still needs to be painted with details that are present on the left side but not on the right side. The museum has recently looked over a proposal that revolves around adding a miniature rideable railroad around the museum, British-style buffers in front of the Flying Duchess, as well as a crossing bridge. While that won't be happening anytime soon, there's something else that will. On November 25th, 2020, the LaGrange Railroad Museum released renderings of their proposed educational park. This educational park will cover the history of the Flying Duchess, the Plymouth Shunter, and the museum as a whole. The museum is seeking $6,500 needed for the construction. As of December of 2020, $260 has been raised. In January of 2021, the LaGrange Railroad Museum plans on submitting the proposal to the city of LaGrange for approval. If approved, the museum can finish its fundraising efforts and start construction. Once it's completed, it'll teach the history of the Flying Duchess to people from LaGrange and abroad.